Greetings all. Welcome to another session here of Tuesday Talks. In this session we're going to be learning a little bit more about the history of the English language. In particular, we'll look at the Middle English and the dialects and the diversity and how Middle English became more standard as it moved along in time. We'll look at some of the variety of things that were there and how one dialect, one area began to push standardization throughout the island. Let's begin by looking at the earlier times, right after the Norman invasion and the takeover there, and we have the beginning, those first couple of hundred years, and we see basically we have a lot of the Old English that's still there. Obviously, it was there for 6 centuries, and we see some of the French influence that's coming in, and actually there's really no set standard, not for speaking and not for writing. With regard to writing, now there were monasteries that were out. There were people who were learning and writing in those places, but there was no set standard. What that means is you could spell any the way you wanted. You could pronounce any way that you wanted. People, basically what they did was they tried to copy exactly what was in the document that they were dealing with, and then of course they began to add extra personalized things to the writing system that was there. But primarily, it stayed pretty much the same during this transition, a couple of hundred years there. Now, eventually, there is greater influence among the French, among the Spanish, and people who are speaking English and reading and writing in English. They're starting to be a little afraid that their language is going to go bye-bye, and so they want to try to preserve their language. They're a little worried about it. They're anxious because of the pressures of all these other languages. Let's face it, when something becomes popular, okay, people want to join that bandwagon, and of course the English didn't want their language to go down. They were worried, or at least some were worried about it, and so they wanted to try to standardize things, keep everybody together instead of splintering off into a bunch of different dialects that wouldn't be strong. So there was this change within the writing system. Basically, what you're going to start seeing is you're going to see more types of standardization. So there were events that were happening politically, as far as countries getting stronger and extending their power out politically to other areas, and the English wanted to make sure that their language was going to be preserved. They're already being pressed down, by the way, by the French. The French government that's there running their country, and it's all in French in the court and in the legal system and that kind of thing. The abbeys weren't so, but so after the conquest, you see begin to see changes in Middle English. Again, there was no standard for spelling. There was no standard for writing. Groups of, there may be a particular abbey they didn't have any, these are the rules for the house. These are the rules for this monastery as far as how you write and how you spell. Now, that began to change as we started having more French words come into English. One particular example you can see is the differentiation between U and V and F. A lot of French words, a lot of Old English words as well, began with the sound of U for a word that was a fricative, a U or a V, but then they began to add the F sound for voiceless versus voiced fricatives, and you begin to see this dichotomy within the writing. And they did this so they could distinguish the sounds between a voiced fricative and a non-voiced fricative, okay? And that's the example of F and V. The F sound has no voice. It's just f. The V sound has the same place where you put your mouth, but you also add voice, so it's v. And so in order to write that down so they could see the difference, they began to use this new letter, which was F. We use it now, but it was a new sound letter that they started adding, and it was a local thing. The purpose for spelling, at least way back then in the Middle Ages, was primarily so people could read and pronounce it. Not everybody everywhere. You were doing it for your local group. You were doing it for the people around you. You weren't doing it for people who were living in Germany. Okay, you were doing it locally. And so those were the rules that began to be made. You would make it for just your local group. Now, this eventually started to get bigger, and they started creating a standard. But originally, it was just for local local pronunciation. There are documents that we have where one person in one letter will write the same word 2 or 3 times and will spell it differently those 2 or 3 times. It didn't matter, provided that it could be understood. I often say, why can't why can't you spell words any way you want to? Why can't you, this word here? This is a perfectly legitimate word, right? Okay, and that would be the word the Christ, as in Christ. I can spell it that way, not a problem, because it's understood. I can't do that today because there are the spelling wizards that try to keep us in line and say, no, 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 there's a correct spelling. Well, back in the Middle East, in the Middle Ages, that didn't exist, okay? Now, at least not initially, right? So we begin to see the differences here. The main reason for spelling was for pronunciation at the local level. Now, the problem is they're introducing all these new words. And they start introducing new words, and then they see things like, ology, or they see things like, pre, as in prepare or present, or, prelude. And they say, you know what, I like that meaning. Let's start attaching that to English-based words, Old English words. And so they start combining these endings that come from French or from Latin or from Greek. They start adding them to English. They start making these new words. They start loaning words and they start combining morphemes. Okay, they make neologisms, and these are new words. Okay? You guys can do this too. You make up a new word. You combine a couple things together and you make up a new word. If it becomes somewhat popular, it's a neologism. If it becomes real popular, it becomes a new word. Shakespeare was renowned for his creating of new words. And we use some of the words that he created today. That's what's happening here, because we have the influx of French and Latin, and so we're starting to combine these with our Old English to make new words. Fun, right? We're getting some diversity. So now take a look at the major languages that are involved here. We have major dialect, which are Kentish, is the Kentish area, the Midlands, and the Northern area, right? The East Midlands, which is London, okay, and that's where you have where your major language is going to be emerging from eventually. That's the melting pot that we're going to see eventually. In the northern area, we have Northumbrian, which is where the Old English and also the Anglo-Saxon area. In the south, we have Kentish and West Saxon. Now, we have the north and the south. We had very different dialects that were going on here. Remember, in the south, they had more of the influence of the French and of Latin, and in the north they had less of that. They had more of the Old English and more of the Anglican. Now there were some places in the central areas where there was also Old English, but it got to the point where people in the northern part of the island, when I say northern, I'm not talking about beyond Scotland, but in the Northumbria area, and people in the southern part, right, their dialect was so different that they couldn't understand each other. And yet it was still called English. Now, at some point I said to myself, well, why do they can still call it English? Well, we have this today. There are places in England, Great Britain today, where someone is speaking English on the telly, and at the bottom of the telly there are subtitles because the pronunciation is so different. It's so difficult to understand that they put in subtitles. I know that the same thing happens in the country of Japan, where if you're listening to someone, if you're from the city, if you're from Tokyo or Osaka, and you're listening to somebody who's speaking from the northern mountain region, oftentimes they'll put in subtitles because it's not understandable to them. The dialect was very different, and that's what you're going to see here in Middle England, or in Middle English. You're going to see people, even though they're speaking quote-unquote the same language, they have very much difficulty understanding one another. The Northern dialect is a continuation of the Northumbrian variant. It's Old English coupled with some Anglo-Saxon, right? And that had spread to some areas. Scotland was also having its own language. That was the Picts and the Scots, right? And it was continuing up to more recent times. The Kentish was the most direct continuation of Old English. And it more or less just stayed in that area. Southern West Saxon, which we'll look at in just a minute, is the forerunner of the dialect in Middle English. Okay, so West Saxon is for most part is going to be where a lot of the changes are going to occur, and those changes will then spread to where all the other Old English and other languages and dialects are. On the west side of the island, there's also the Celtic speaking in Cornwall, and that area again is going to be interesting, but they're going to lose their strength as well as Middle English becomes stronger. We have the West Midlands, the most conservative area, okay, West Midlands, so it's above, it's kind of in the middle in the west, and they are the ones that retain the Old English for a very long time. East Midland is where the Middle English Standard begins. And that's where London is, and that's where the hotbed of all the melting pot of new ideas, new words, new grammar emerges, right? That's where this comes out. And eventually that's where we get the term received pronunciation. We'll talk about received pronunciation a little later. Here's a map of the island, and right in this area is about where London is, and that's where the hotbed of everything is going to be. In this area, again, the West Midland, or in the Central Midland, basically in this area is where a lot of the Old English stayed and remained. Again, Cornwall, they're going to be Celtic. This is eventually going to lose power, right? And we've got all these different sections here, and it's from this area where Middle English begins to spread. Okay, that's where it begins to spread. All right. Now, this is after 1350. After 1350, you see more standardization appearing. Middle English moves closer and closer to a set standard because what's happened in England, or what's happened in London, it has begun to surge out into other areas, and people are now wanting to speak and write the way the king speaks and writes. That becomes the standard. There's a whole bunch of new words that are being entered into the language, and that's a big thing. Because of these new words, of course, they're going to adopt the quote-unquote new standards. Okay? Now, 1362 is a big year. That is the year that the government decided, the British government decided, from now on, all of their court proceedings, okay, all of the documents that are being done by the king and so forth are all going to be done in English. They're no longer going to be done in French. Okay, so in a sense, they're looking over the channel over at France, and they're thumbing their nose at them and saying, "We're not going to use your language anymore. We're going to adopt ours." So that was a big thing for them to do this. The legal documents, okay, the law, lawyers and judges and such, they don't move over for another couple of hundred years. They stay in French. Again, we native English speakers, especially in the United States, we don't realize the power that French had for so many years. Relatively speaking, at least American English is very small. Look at this, 1362, the 14th century to the 17th century, French was used as the language of the legal system. That's amazing. Again, but eventually it falls out of play, and they replace that, okay? Because the court now decided to do everything in English, the need for French became reduced. The need for English has now become stronger, and that's good for them. Yay. Middle English now is going to have a stronger system because of it. In 1350, there was the Linguistic Atlas of Late Middle English. And basically what happened is there was a commission set up to go out and catalog all of the different languages and dialects that were being used throughout the country. This is a huge task, and it's only the first of many that are going to happen as they try to catalog what's going on with the English language. Okay, so we're seeing this change. Okay, the changing in the court is a huge thing, and what follows, of course, is more and more people, more and more schools that are going to set up standardized rules for writing and then eventually speaking. As time passed, okay, there was more orthographic license, okay? In other words, people began to create more of their own spelling. They began to add on little extra sound, letters and whatnot, okay? And then they created some Missprache. I wonder if you can tell me what that means. Words that didn't necessarily make any sense, right? let's move on here. London English. Okay, remember what I said before. It's in the London area where you have the greatest influence of all of these languages coming together and things that are melding and merging, and it's creating more of a lively and morphed English language. Okay, there's more linguistic variety there. There's more vocabulary. They also have multiple word order systems. Again, in current modern English, there's pretty much the order is set. You have subject, verb, and object. Only a very few times where you can have subject, object, verb. As I mentioned before, I thee wed is a phrase I'm allowed to say. I thee wed, but I can't say. It's harder for me to say I you wed. Usually it's set in stone. Back in the Middle Ages now, we have this modern one, but we have others as well because of the different endings that were there. We have multiple word systems. We have multiple spelling systems. Excuse me. Now, different places, different abbeys began to set up a standard, right? Individual, small, local. But globally, there was no capitalization system. There was no punctuation system. So groups can do what they want, okay? Part of me says, I like that. I want to spell the way I want to spell. I want to add punctuation where I want to add it. Today, of course, we have all these rules, and it's global, and everything is locked down. We can't do that. So my question that I have to you is it bad? Is it bad that you have multiple ways of spelling a word? Is it readable? Okay, then, not a problem. Is it, do I have to capitalize, at the beginning of a sentence? What if I don't want to? What if I like it a different style? That's okay, isn't it? Right? Who cares? Well, today, someone cares. And you may not like all the rules that are there, but if you're going to live in somebody's pond, if you're going to live in the business world, or you're going to live in the academic world, you're going to go to college, or you're going to, work at a bank, you better obey their rules because it's their pond. When you get large enough to where you can start creating your own, that's a different issue. But for the most of us, we're going to have to kowtow to whatever that system is. Okay. Anyway, is it bad? Well, I don't know, but you should probably be able to understand and explain that. Standardization is now emerging because of all of the things that are happening with language. You begin to see different styles of writing. Someone who's writing and they write to one group and they have one writing style. They write to another group and they have a different writing style. You see, again, part of this is because of that atlas that they used. Where is that here? Part of that is because of this linguistic atlas that they developed. They're beginning to see the differences between personal writing and public writing, and the different words they use, and the different styles that they use, and began to see that there's this difference. There's a difference between these groups, okay? The grammar and the sound structures, right? It also suggests that there were publishing houses, scriptoriums as they were called, and they were developing writing standards. So in other words, a group of these schools, these writing places began to say, hey, let's work together to develop this standard so that we all can write together, so that we all can interact together, so that we all have a similar standard, right? At this time also, again, this is now the late Middle Ages, Middle English, we have the development of external bookshops. External places where people are making books. Okay, again, it was originally relegated to the religious institutions, the abbeys, the monasteries, the places of learning, which were those things, now being moved out into other places where people are making books for selling, okay, because people can read. As I mentioned before, there was a great influence in the London area, but there was also an influence in the Central Midland area. And that's the Central Midland area is where a lot of the French, I take that back, where a lot of Old English was still strong. And it was during this time as well that Wycliffe published his Bible, and he published it in English. Wycliffe, of course, was later considered a heretic, and he was kicked out of the church. And with it, some of the popularity of the older style Middle English and Old English. Okay, so he actually helped bring in or strengthen this Old English, the more traditional style of writing from that era. But the Central Midland Standard English fell out of repute. It did not gain the strength that some may have hoped. But Wycliffe helped to bring that forward. Of course, it didn't last because of his situation. Um, Old English actually was used in more places, okay, unlike the northern and southern dialects. The central dialect, of course, was in the more major area, closer to the London area. The dialects of the north and of the south, they were less used. Okay, they were the ones that had trouble communicating with one another. But we begin to see this standardization during this time. Even though there's this push for the Central Midland Standard, it doesn't survive. The London Standard becomes the major Middle English standard. Again, we're talking about 60, 70 years later in 1417, King Henry begins to correspond. This is now personal correspondence in English. Okay, he decides that all of his personal correspondence is going to be in English. Any edicts that he sends out are going to be in English. Not just the court now, but him personally. Everything gets switched to English, right? The fear that English was going to go away now has been eliminated because we now have another major entity, and later on you're going to see even another when the legal system changes, decide that they're going to use English as their standard. So when the king decides to send out an edict or send out an order or send out any type of information, it gets relegated through his writing system, and people want to adopt that writing system. Okay? So, again, why did he do this? He did this because he wanted to thumb his nose at France. We are no longer going to be succumbing to your language. We're going to use our own, right? And so he said basically, yeah, I'm not going to do this. The other reason was to demonstrate their independence. We are independent from you, France. Even though the Norman invasion meant that they took over, that was 300 years ago, right? They're saying we're now going to be separate. So a couple of reasons why the king did this. Linguistically, of course, it's a benefit to the English language because it solidifies their life, their activity, their usefulness on the island. Now, when the king's documents were copied, they were probably, although not for sure, probably copied in the office of the chancellor or the chancery. And the chancery became a standard. They wrote in a certain way, and then, of course, when they had these things sent out to other offices throughout the country, they had to copy and follow those. And people wanted to follow that standard. And then, of course, that standard fell down into the monasteries and the schools, and they began to become the standard for writing. So it may have become the standard. The standard that emerges seems to be a national standard, right? Or it could have been something more local. But the assumption here is that the chancery is what the king used, and because the king sent it out everywhere, it became the standard. All right. After this stabilization is happening, after this standardization starts to occur from the 1300s, you see massive changes in Middle English. Old English ideas are being dropped away. You're moving to a more defined sentence order. You're gaining more letters. We gained F. We're gaining more morphemes. Okay, we're gaining more standards for writing, and then of course for pronouncing. And so we see between Old English to Modern English, these 400 or 500 years, you're seeing massive changes in things. I mean, they added a letter. When was the last time we added a letter to the English language? We got a big change in there. We have a change in the standard of writing. Things have become more nationalized as a country, and they're adopting the writing standard the same way. After we get into Middle English, okay, it's still difficult to read, but there's certainly a lot easier to read than the Old English was. The Old English, for the typical native speaker today, they're not going to be able to understand it. Middle English, you're going to be able to understand some of it. There's still going to be changes that are going on between Middle English and Early Modern English. Early Modern English is basically what Shakespeare wrote in, and you'll be able to read that. You may not understand all the words, but you'll be able to read it. It'll use primarily all the same letters and words that we're using today. The sentence order is going to be the same. All that's going to be pretty much standardized throughout Middle English. Okay, we're seeing, a change kind of quickly at the beginning, and then when we get to the end of Middle English, it tends to be it's more stabilized. There will be some changes as we go along, but it's much more stabilized than before, than what it was in the past. If you're interested in getting more information about the Middle English dialects or some of the history of the English language, here are a couple places that I was at that I got some of this information, as well as from the textbook that we're using, which is Mugglestone's textbook. And that's all I have for this chapter. I do hope you're enjoying to see all these changes and all of the modifications of language because of the politics that's going on, and the education and the unity of the country. Okay, talk to you guys later. Have a nice day.